And another major influence is submission doctrine. And I really believe that this is next generation Gothardism, and the patriarchy movement just inserts father in there instead of the enlightened leaders within Gothardism, which would be Bill Gothard. It's very paternalistic. It's pessimistic about the believer's own ability to live the Christian life. It requires intervention on behalf of some enlightened mediator. It's very works-oriented, and grace is merited through works and through attitude after initial salvation. And then what I call the spiritual covering superstition, that if you circumvent your natural authority or whoever is your authority, that great harm and calamity will come upon you for doing so, because God will work through your natural authority. Patriarchy, for the purposes of this talk, I will only be referring to the intolerant ideology of the so-called biblical patriarchy that has emerged from within Christian circles in the homeschooling movement over the past 15 years or so. And I say that it is the so-called biblical patriarchy movement because even though it does contain a great many biblical elements, it also contains many things that aren't, such as social preferences and religious preferences, some of which actually come from, some suggest come from pagan Hellenistic doctrine. And it is intolerant, because it prescribes this, the rigid practices and moral imperatives to the whole body of Christ. This is by no means a monolithic movement, but rather encompasses many different denominations within Christianity. I believe that patriarchy is a disproportionate Christian response to cultural decline, and it sees family as central to the restoration of our culture. In that sense, it could be called a homeschooling special purpose religion or an affinity group. It is very neo-tribalistic, authoritarian, and evangelistically pessimistic. It is neo-tribal in that rather than engage our culture, it rather seeks to withdraw from our culture in a very fearful and what often is a survival mentality. And it is very pietistic. It's authoritarian, attracts people in need of a high degree of structure, and it often uses heavy-handed means to carry out its objectives. It's evangelistically pessimistic in that rather than direct evangelistic efforts towards the lost in our culture, it seeks to evangelize other Christians, calling them into patriarchy through parachurch organizations. They also do an excellent job at using neologism and connotation. And this is consistent with the thought reform technique of the loading of the language, and they turn a lot of biblical words and concepts into thought-stopping cliches. I've already mentioned egalitarianism.
I'm not familiar with those terms.
Sure. Loading of the language was identified as one of Robert Lifton's thought reform criteria when he counseled prisoners of war that came out of the Korean War. And they were subjected to a technique of surreptitious manipulation. So they redefine a lot of terms, and that's another thing that Federal Vision did. Use a lot of pejoratives and monikers. One term that, biblical. They particularly attach the modifier biblical, particularly to things related to gender. Biblical manhood, biblical womanhood. And it suggests that if you challenge their concept of biblical manhood, or whatever, that you're actually challenging biblical authority. So in that sense, the term biblical, because it's just so excessively used, becomes a thought-stopping cliche, because you take for granted that you know what it means.